in the development and evolution of colonial British North America from the early 17th century till the era of the American Revolution, there's no question that there is incredible mistreatment and expropriation of indigenous people, meaning dispossession of indigenous people of their lands. But there's also many cases of perfectly peaceable interactions, perfectly peaceable diplomatic and commercial exchanges by which land is traded hands, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Now, the United States is founded in the 1770s and 1780s. And it was the dominant view of the founders. I'm talking about people like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, all of these kind of classic founders figures. You could call them, I say, if I could use an old term, ethnocentric, but you could not call them racist in any kind of essential sense, meaning they believed that all people could be full participants in what they called commercial society, or what Marxists call bourgeois society, that all people could be free laborers, property owners, freely cooperating and transacting with one another. They believed that. And in fact, this is how they thought the problem of westward expansion was going to be solved, meaning people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson thought that the kind of really terrible relationships that had often occurred between colonial settlers and indigenous groups could be overcome with the formation of the United States, because they believed that the attraction of the new kind of civilization they were building, which I'll simply just call a bourgeois civilization, would be such that they would be able to pull the indigenous people into it and integrate them within it.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like, you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with James Vaughn, professor of history at the University of Chicago and a founding member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. I'm having on James today to discuss the American Revolution and the ways that leftists today and leftists historically have interpreted it, particularly the difference between the way Marxists and progressives today interpret the American Revolution. And this is sort of a follow-up discussion, which I got a lot of value from, that I had with James on the YouTube channel called The Swoletariat, in which we had a little friendly debate of sorts, or conversation about the American Revolution and some of his critiques of the way people have today interpreted it. He has a very interesting thesis that some listening to this show might find quite surprising or controversial. And I had certain objections to it, but at the core, I found much of what he had to say highly compelling. I recommend you check out his talks, but today you'll get a solid overview of a lot of under-discussed questions regarding the American Revolution and socialists' relation to it. So first and foremost, James, what was the global significance of the American Revolution, and why is it important for Marxists, socialists, or anarchists, people on the left of center, to think about this and its importance, and what do they miss? Now, this is a big question. We'll obviously go into more what they miss specifically, but it's significance, because I think that can be taken for granted.
Sure. Well, first off, Tony, thank you for having me on your podcast. And It is a big question. I guess the initial stab I will take at it is as follows. I like to say that America is not so much a country that had a revolution as it is a revolution that has a country. And what I mean by that broadly is that the bourgeois revolution, what classical Marxism understood as the bourgeois revolution, the process by which civil society came into being and effectively conquered political power, the state power, and subjected it to itself, received its highest expression in the American Revolution and more broadly in the period known as the founding of the United States from the 1760s to the 1780s. And I think that the reason why it has global significance is essentially twofold. One, it is not some particularly it's not events that play some peculiar development in colonial British North America, meaning you can't really understand the American Revolution if you understand it simply as, a product of particular developments of colonial British North America. It is, of course, immediately that, meaning anybody who wants to think about the American Revolution properly historically would have to think about the evolution of colonial British North America and its crisis in the era of the American Revolution. But nevertheless, it is much more importantly the playing out in local and particular circumstances, colonial British North America in the 1770s and 1780s, of global social and historical developments that I will simply for now summarize as the unfolding bourgeois revolution. Secondly, why it's so important is you have for the first time the creation of country that is not in some broad sense rooted in blood and soil. That is to say, the United States of America does not have some deep civilizational background in some kind of long-standing cultural development like you might talk about in China or France or Egypt, but rather it really just has the ideas, the political ideas enunciated at the time of the American Revolution, the American founding. And essentially, the United States is very peculiar because it is a country. I mean, it's peculiar in terms of prior world history because it's a country that is, in some broad sense, uniquely philosophical. Now, what I mean by that is not that the people of the United States are philosophers. What I mean by that is the United States is uniquely philosophical when it's founded because it is not rooted in blood and soil ties and commitments, but rather in a shared political project, a set of political ideas. And to participate in that project requires only accepting those ideas. That's what I would take as the initial step for the importance, the global significance of the American Revolution. On one hand, it is essentially the highest expression by the late 18th century of the bourgeois revolution, which had been a global phenomenon. And two, gives birth to the first country that is not rooted in blood and soil connections.
Now, when you say the highest expression of the bourgeois revolution, what do you mean by that?
Effectively, the bourgeois revolution unfolds across, broadly speaking, the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And in places like the Netherlands is really where, you get early elements of the bourgeois revolution, say Italian Renaissance city-states, etc. But a whole even greater expression is achieved in the Netherlands, the Dutch Republic of the later 16th and early 17th century. And then even greater in Great Britain, England/Great Britain in the 17th century with the English Civil Wars, the brief life of the English Republic, and then later the Glorious Revolution of 1689. And then, of course, after that, on even greater levels, the French Revolution. The American Revolution, which is bound up with those revolutionary developments unfolding across the West in the early modern world. The American Revolution constitutes a regime that goes on to the present. That is to say, the American Revolution constitutes a regime that continues into the present. And it is essentially the ideals at the heart of the American Revolution are the fulfillment of ideals that we've seen in development since the broad early modern period of the unfolding bourgeois revolution. So let me put this a different way. Maybe I'm kind of speaking in tongues, as it were. If you think about the ideals of bourgeois radicalism, which is that you have individual and collective freedom. That is, that people individually set the course of their own existence. They determine their own lives, but they're also able, or they also live in a society where they're able to freely, socially, and economically cooperate with other people, and therefore transform the world around them. Those ideals, right, sort of say as received their expression in something like Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, right? Adam Smith's concept of what he calls the system of natural liberty or the system of perfect liberty is one in which free individuals set the course of their own life, but in the totality of their ongoing social and economic cooperation, they bring into being something greater than the sum of its parts, which Smith famously called commercial society, which Marxism famously refers to as bourgeois society. And that society is much greater than the sum of its parts. And you could say that in the same year that Adam Smith writes The Wealth of Nations, and well, you could definitely say this, I should say, in the same year that Adam Smith writes The Wealth of Nations in 1776, you have the American Revolution, and in some degree, the political realization of the ideals that Smith is enunciating in The Wealth of Nations. That is, that people should be able to set the course of their own lives, and that the main purpose of the government is not to basically determine how people lead their lives, but rather to provide the public infrastructure necessary for the free play of private interests, to provide the political order that allows civil society to flourish on its own. So another way of putting this would be to say that the state is not the master of civil society, but rather civil society, that is the public realm of the free and consensual interactions between individuals to pursue collective ends that they could not accomplish on their own. That realm, civil society, is the master of the state. The people of the United States are understood not to serve the government of the United States, but the government of the United States is understood to serve the people. And the government of the United States should not determine the course of people's lives, but rather should provide the necessary public infrastructure for people to be able to set the course of their own lives. So I guess when I say the United States is the highest expression of the bourgeois revolution, what we can see developing in the unfolding bourgeois revolution of the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries in the West is this emergence of civil society and its increasing demands that the state be subject to it, that the state is not its master, but rather the state is its servant. So when I say the American Revolution is the highest expression of the bourgeois revolution, I mean that's because the American Revolution is when civil society captured control of the state, subjected the state to itself, and constituted a political regime that continues on into our own day.
It might be worth breaking down what civil society is to the uninitiated listener, because when you say in your speech, for example, which I thought was excellent, you gave this talk at Platypus, the Marxist organization, in which you gave a rundown on the history leading up to the American Revolution and the bourgeois revolutions, how relations transformed away from serfdom and away from feudalism to absolute monarchy, but then absolute monarchy, while having new social relations, still was opposed to civil society in a large extent. And then you have bourgeois ideas and liberal ideas, and the bourgeois revolutions gradually happen. You talk about all of that. In the speech, you say that with bourgeois revolutions, the very conception of society as such was thinkable. That might seem like a crazy claim to somebody. What do you mean by that? And what is civil society? Because those who haven't studied political science or, well, social sciences more broadly might not be so familiar with that. They might have a vague idea what it means. We live our lives, private lives. But the idea that this wasn't always a thing might seem a bit surprising.
No, that's a very important point. Those are two big questions. Let me separate both out. So what is civil society? Obviously, the Marxist tradition, which obviously Marx himself, right, being German, obviously we're talking about the German term Bürgerliche Gesellschaft, which means simultaneously in English, you could translate it, I should say, that German term, bürgerliche Gesellschaft, you could translate to English as either bourgeois society or civil society. And the reason why I choose when I talk about civil society often rather than bourgeois society is not because I don't think that they're broadly speaking one and the same thing. I do. But because I fear that when one says bourgeois society, a lot of people hear society of the bourgeoisie. And that's not what I mean at all when I say bourgeois society. In fact, I would insist that's not what classical Marxism meant at all when it said bourgeois society. So if you read the writings of Marx and Engels, they constantly refer to bourgeois society, by which they do not mean the society of the bourgeoisie, the capitalists. They mean the society that produces the bourgeoisie or the capitalists, but the social form itself is much greater and beyond the bourgeoisie or the capitalists. So let me say more about that. Essentially, if you just think about your life in the world today, right? You're an individual. You may live on your own. You may live with the family, but in your oikos, in your household, that's your kind of private life, your family affairs, your domestic arena. And then you go out into the world. And while some aspects out in the world in public life are based on coercion, meaning you have to do this and not do this, and that's usually associated with the state is ultimately, right, the part of public life, the public realm that is rooted in coercion. Hey, you must do this at the point of, imprisonment, confinement, and then sometimes even death. But there is also, right, a whole realm of public relations is really what I'm talking about when I say civil society, which are free relations of everyday life based just completely on voluntary and consensual interaction, cooperation with other people. And in fact, most of our lives are lived, if you will, in civil society, right? That is neither really in the state nor in the privacy of our family lives or households, but rather in civil society, in our free, ongoing daily operations with other people, right? Interacting out of our mutual self-interests and aspirations, right? And so that is a whole realm of experience, right? That according to classical Marxism, really, and with which I agree, by the way, really begins to emerge in the later Middle Ages and Renaissance era in the West, and obviously comes into its own with the full flourishing of, I apologize, comes its own with the full flourishing of bourgeois society in the early modern period and becomes global in scope with capitalist modernity in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so that's what I mean when I say civil society. And should I move on to the other question, or would you like to ask more about that?
I was going to go to the Marxist position since you brought it up, but I think it is actually worth emphasizing the gravitas of that transformation, because when you said that the whole conception of society as such seems like a rather big claim, but it's interesting to get into because, of course, if you take like sociology class, people know that urbanization is a big factor, or a history class, urbanization is a big factor in the concept of society. The idea of when people all move to cities due to changing modes of production. But how does the liberal bourgeois revolution, as manifested in its highest expression in the American Revolution, affect our conception of society as such and things we might take for granted today?
Oh, okay. Yes. And that was the other part of your question.
Yes.
So many historians have pointed out, I'm certainly not the only one that thinks this. There's if your listeners are interested, there's an excellent short article by a historian of the French Revolution named Keith Baker called The Invention of Society or something like that. But the point is to say that across all the modern across all kind of major Western languages in the 17th and 18th century, Spanish, French, Italian, German, English, right? Society, that word begins to take on a different meaning, right? Like we literally see the modern concept of the social come into being. And effectively, I would argue that's bound up effectively with the rise of bourgeois social relations. That is, for a whole series of events we need not to get into the details of, in the later Middle Ages and the early modern period, basically across large swaths of Western Europe, commodity production and exchange starts to become generalized, right? That is the commodity form of labor, free laborers, right? Freely exchanging the products of their labor. Okay. That basically in early modern Western Europe, you get the increasing generalization of commodity production exchange because you have a world of increasingly free labor based on the commodity form of labor where people are freely exchanging their labor and its products. That world basically is one in which the same time individuals are increasingly independent and self-determining. Meaning, I'll give you a classic example of this. You're no longer subject to a feudal lord. However, at the same time, right, the whole possibilities of your existence are profoundly and deeply shaped on a growing social interdependence with other people. Okay. That is to say, when bourgeois society emerges in the West in the early modern period, you have simultaneously the emergence of independent, self-determining individuals, but on the same at the same time, a growth of a denser social interdependence between people. Okay. And that may seem paradoxical, but it's nevertheless true, right? If you were to look at the average day laborer in Western Europe in, say, 1750, you would say that the course that he was freer on an individual level to determine the course of existence than ever before. But you would also see that he was more dependent upon, that is more interdependent upon other people to pursue the course of existence than ever before. Okay. So if you were looking at, say, a peasant village in medieval France, you would basically say these people do not have much individual independence, right? They're under the direct, overt domination of the feudal lord. But you would also point out they don't have much social interdependence. That is to say, right, they mostly produce everything they need for their own consumption. The peasant family grows its own foodstuffs and its necessities of life, maintains its own shelter, spins and weaves its own clothes. And maybe there's a bit of a surplus that is exchanged in the village, etc. But by and large, there's very little interdependence, right, upon people with other areas of the world. If you look at the European day laborer and say, if you'd say, take a French day laborer in, say, 1750. So the first example, let's say, is a French peasant in 1300, right? Individually, not independent much at all. That is to say, subject to a feudal lord, but socially not very dependent upon or interdependent with other people at all. That is really not depending for the reproduction of their everyday life on a lot of other people and processes, right? But if you look at the European day laborer in, say, or the French day laborer in, say, 1750, he is individually more independent than ever before, right? He's not subject of a feudal lord. But on the other hand, he is dependent for his individual life, for determining the course of his own existence, on whole series of relations, increasingly free social and economic cooperation with other people, right? He is not, right, a peasant living in subsistence agriculture, producing for his immediate consumption. Rather, he is making something or he's working for somebody who either he's making something he sells on the market or he's working for somebody who sells that thing on the market, and he makes a wage, right? Or he makes money and goes back out in the market and buys all the other things he needs. So there is when bourgeois society emerges, when commodity production and exchange becomes generalized, when the commodity of form of labor grows, that you have this seemingly paradoxical, but really not, development, which is individuals are increasingly, on the one hand, independent to determine the course of existence, but also interdependent. That is, their ability to set the course of their own lives is deeply bound up with much greater degrees of social and economic cooperation with other people. Okay. Kant referred to this as unsocial sociability, Immanuel Kant. And so it's in that context, and we can see this, and I would insist that the two are related. The reason why across the major Western European languages in the 17th and 18th century, in Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, German, French, English, society begins to take on a different character, right? It becomes much more of those languages, much more of an abstraction. Like it's not a particular society. In the Middle Ages, in most European language, society had been like a particular group of people for a particular purpose, like a society of artificers, a society of haberdashers. But what we see developing across all the major West European languages in the 17th and 18th centuries is this idea of society as a kind of abstraction, a kind of general realm that is the, if you will, the ground of our existence. Okay. And it's really with the Enlightenment that people begin to become aware of the fact that not only has a new form of society come in existence, what Enlightenment thinkers call commercial society, what classical Marxists call bourgeois society, but they also become increasingly aware that human beings have always been determining themselves in and through society, their social relations with others. So there's really two really key developments by the 18th century Enlightenment in Western Europe. One, the conclusion that they're living in a fundamentally new form of social life, which they call commercial society and which Marxists call bourgeois society. And two, they also realize retrospectively that human beings are not determined by the stars or the gods or biology or, the course of the planets, but rather that human beings, the most important grounds of their existence, where they really shape and transform themselves, is in and through their social relations, the societies they create, right? So it's a key insight of the Enlightenment that not only do we live in a radically new form of society, but also that the grounds of our existence, humanity's existence, have always been most profoundly shaped by the societies that they bring into existence.
Of course, it would be very hard to deny the influence the American Revolution has globally, with the French Revolution, of course, kind of being a ironic outcome given that the French, under when France was still absolute monarchy, backing the Americans against the British, kind of helping the revolution, even building the Statue of Liberty, but only to strategically, of course, against the British Empire, only to later inspire radicals, the Jacobins in France, to conduct their own revolution, which is, of course, colossally impactful. And then there's Haitian Revolution, and there's complications with that. But I always thought it was self-evident that the American Revolution influenced the French Revolution, given that Declaration of Independence was the Declaration of the Rights of Man was inspired by Thomas Paine and Jefferson, literally passages taken from them. But I have heard people say that, well, actually, no, it's its own thing entirely because it's a democratic Republican tradition. It shouldn't be viewed as an inspiration. It's inspired by Thomas Paine, who was jailed in America, and Jefferson, yeah, his ideas didn't get implemented anyway because you had more the Hamiltonian and Madisonian ideas of the Constitution get implemented. That's what people say. This sort of is bringing us closer to the crux of the discussion, which is the ways in which leftists have interpreted the revolution. But at first, I do want to say, before we get into the historical Marxist position, is like this specific question, this specific relation between the French Revolution and American Revolution. I'm curious how you view this and the way leftists view this, because I find it interesting that, well, it's not that surprising, but leftists are usually of the radical sort, are usually very supportive of the French Revolution, but very dismissive of the American Revolution. How do you view the relation between these two revolutions? And perhaps this could be a segue into how Marxists, the classical Marxists, meaning Marx, Engels, Lenin, Kautsky, how did they view the American Revolution?
So it is absolutely the case that, as you say, the American Revolution and French Revolution are today often spoken about very differently. It is also very much the case that is a complete invention of subsequent history. That is, at the time of the American and French Revolution, people, that is the later 18th century Western world, people absolutely saw them as profoundly related to one another. I could go through all the interconnection. I'll just briefly talk about some of them. It is the case that the court of Louis XVI, who the then ruler of Bourbon France, decides to support the rebellion of the American colonists against the British Empire as a kind of war of revenge. That is to say, France had been very badly defeated by Great Britain across the globe during the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War took place from 1756 to 1753. And France lost much of its empire in that time period to basically British arms. The French are thoroughly defeated in South Asia. They're defeated in North America. This is why, Quebec is part of Canada, right? It becomes part of British Canada, et cetera. And as a result, there's no question that the court of Louis XVI backs the American rebellion to a degree because of the desire of a war of revenge against Great Britain. But nevertheless, there are also a number of people in and around French high politics in the 1770s and 1780s who are closet Republicans and radicals. That is to say, they also recognize in the American Revolution something new going on, a much more radical political experiment unfolding. And so they very strongly push or advise the French monarchy towards supporting the revolution. And it's also the case that throughout Europe, there's incredible interest in and support of what's known as the War of American Independence, right? They're very interested. You see this throughout European newspapers, European pamphlets are being written. People are raising money. They're taking subscriptions. People raising money and material. There's a very famous playwright, Beaumarchais. He writes, which will, the Barber of Seville or Barber of Sevilla, right? Which Mozart famously turns into an opera. Beaumarchais is an incredible, what we would call, he's basically a gun runner and gun dealer. He's an international arms dealer. And he ends up running a ton of guns and money surreptitiously to the Americans. So while the court of Louis XVI backs the American rebellion against the British Empire as a war of revenge, just out of a kind of a French realpolitik, if you will, many people in France and wider Europe absolutely support the Americans, not just with ideas, but with arms and money, because they see it as a radical political project. I mean, it's hard for us to think about this now because we lose sight of this. But if we have to try and put yourself in the world of a kind of a late 18th century European philosopher or kind of, like public intellectual, right? There have been all these ideas about social contract theory and what we would call classical liberalism. There have been all of these ideas about the right of resistance, the right of revolution, the ability for free and equal individuals to come together and to form a social and political order of their own design. But that hasn't actually ever existed before, right? There's no case where you can really point to in Europe where the political order that exists in any country is some kind of deliberate design, rational design of the people that are ruled over by that political order, right? That the governed have never kind of rationally designed through a process of democratic deliberation and debate their own government. Meaning many people have written about that in terms of ideas, right? And quite critical ideas. I don't want to undermine this. That is, I mean, I don't want to over-egg the pudding. It is the case that many ideas of the Enlightenment, right, very critical ideas, force reforms in policies, force reforms in the law, particularly in Western Europe. But nevertheless, one of the highest ideals of the Enlightenment, right, the idea that the most appropriate political order would be one where the governed, through democratic deliberation and debate, designed the government that ruled over them. And that's never happened. Nobody can point to that. That allows the conservative Enlightenment figure, David Hume, to point out that social contract theory is a nonsense. Show me where this has ever happened before. Show me wherever before people got together, right, and actually, with any kind of rational intent to designed a government, or where the governed ever came together through kind of deliberation debate and entered into a social compact, a social contract, a social covenant. Where did that happen, right? And Hume just has the most famous essay dismissing social contract theory. That's quite widespread. A great deal of European conservatives in the 18th century right? Who are essentially, I should clarify for your audience, what I mean by conservative is anti-liberals, people who basically think classical liberalism is a fantasy of the philosophes. And it has absolutely no purchase on reality, and effectively that political and social life should be determined by tradition, custom, hierarchy, naturally divinely ordained orders. Those conservatives laugh. But the American Revolution, David Hume's essay doesn't work anymore. Though that conservative critique doesn't work anymore, meaning there is a place in the world, right, where people actually en masse democratically debated and deliberated and designed the government that governed them. Now, of course, you'll quite rightly say to me, and not you, Tony, but your listener will have extreme doubt. What is this crazy person James Vaughn talking about? Right? There was hundreds of thousands of people enslaved in colonial British North America. Women had very little in the way of substantive civil rights and equality. If we look at the franchise, the vote, that was limited to property qualification. You had to own so much land across most of the colonies and New United States to vote. And that's all true, right? All of that is true. But nevertheless, I just think that it's really important to think about history, not backward from the present, but forward from what went before. And if you were sitting around in the world of the late 18th century, what I think would strike you about what happened in colonial British North America between the 1760s and the 1780s is that there was a rebellion against a British imperial authority that claimed not that it was doing it on the basis of traditional customs or traditional usages, but claimed these rebels took up arms to overthrow the British Empire, the greatest power of the day, not on the basis of their traditional rights and privileges, not on the basis of customs and traditions that were being violated, right? Throughout all of human history, there have been uprisings on the basis of customs and traditions being violated, right? Peasants in medieval Europe rose up all the time, but they did so because they claimed that the feudal lords were violating the traditions and customs of feudalism. They were demanding too much production. They were demanding too much of a rent, what have you. But they never wanted to overturn feudalism. They simply wanted to renegotiate. They wanted to renegotiate the terms of their servitude. What's happening in the late 18th century in colonial British North America is these colonists are in rebellion, and they're not saying because our traditional rights and usages and customs have been violated, but rather they're making claims that what should be the rights of people, of all people at all times, are being violated, right? That's the claim they're making. And furthermore, they're saying very clearly, right? You get this with all you need read is Thomas Jefferson, drafted, and then the Second Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. And it's all laid out there, right? Very crystal clear. The justification for the rebellion, what makes it legitimate, what makes this revolution legitimate. So the late 18th century European would see, wait, there are people who are actually claiming that people do have these natural rights, that people are naturally free and equal, self-determining, and that people do, or the government has to be based on the consent of the governed, that government is instituted to serve the people, that government is instituted so that people could enjoy together in society the rights they have. Okay. I mean, just to make things very quick, according to John Locke, right, in the Second Treatise of Government, right, we have natural rights in the state of nature. But the problem is we enter into disputes with one another because we can never really be judges in our own cause. So we don't fully enjoy these rights. And so Locke says it's only when we create political society, or what he calls civil society, by which he means something slightly different than I mean. He means a society organized by law. It's only when we create a society organized by law with a universal judge, a universal referee, i.e. government, that we can fully enjoy our rights. And so Jefferson is saying in the Declaration of Independence, people institute government, right, to better enjoy their rights. And when the government tramples upon and threatens those rights, the legitimacy of the government goes away and the people have the right to dissolve the government and to create a new one. Like, these things have been said, Tony, for 100, 150 years in Western Europe. But you're actually getting an armed revolt against the greatest power of the day on the basis of these ideas. And then, even more so, starting in the later 1770s and 80s, these revolutionary colonies that are becoming independent states are basically getting together in deliberative bodies and provincial congresses and conventions and talking about the need to write down their political order, meaning you can't just have an assumed political order based on tradition and custom and usage. You actually have to write down, you have to have a written constitution. Why? Because the idea is the social contract, right, is actually being created here. They're literally live, if you will, right, democratically debating and deliberating a social contract. And if you think about the US Constitution, right, so the US achieves its effective independence in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, where Great Britain and all the leading European powers recognize the United States as a sovereign country. But there's a great deal of social and political instability in the United States, and its initial framework of government, the Articles of Confederation, which had just created a loosely organized confederacy of states, that basically is replaced by a much greater, stronger federal union, right, with the ratification of the US Constitution. You have to think about that. The US Constitution, although it's written largely in secret in a convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, it's ratified through this massive popular debate. That is to say, all of the different states, 13 states, have ratifying conventions for the Constitution and elections to those ratifying conventions. Most of those states lower the property qualification for adult males to be able to vote and sit in those conventions, and some remove them altogether. But beyond that, there are newspapers, pamphlets, parades, protests. So throughout the fall of 1787 into 1788, when all these ratifying conventions over the Constitution, over this written document that is going to be the fundamental social contract, social compact, the basis of the political community of the United States, while those conventions are going on, people are having parades, protests, and that includes many people, right? We know not just the adult males who meet the property qualification to vote and to sit in the conventions. We know many propertyless adult males, white and black. We know many women are absolutely participating in that wider public sphere, public opinion debate over the ratification of the Constitution. So if you're a European philosopher in, let's say, 1790, you look at what's happened in the United States from during the 1770s and 1780s, and you basically say liberalism, the social contract, has literally come into being there. Like, no one can say anymore that this hasn't happened. And I can't stress any kind of radical intellectual or radical politico or opinion maker in Europe in the late 18th century would have thought these ideas now have had purchase on the world. They've become a practical reality in this country 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean. And that puts paid to all of these conservative reactionary arguments about such a thing is impossible and utopian and a fantasy. And it gives a whole series of encouragement to not just the French Revolution, but revolutions and uprisings throughout the West. There's the Dutch Patriot Revolt, which breaks out in the Netherlands in 1787. The Dutch had a very oligarchic republic. And on the basis of the US example, the Dutch patriots want to pursue a much more democratic republic. There are parliamentary reform movements that get off the ground in Great Britain and Ireland. They don't want to overthrow the British political system, but they do want to reform it to make Parliament more representative over the people that it makes laws for. There is something in the Austrian Netherlands, or what we call Belgium, the Bourbon Revolution, that also wants to create a democratic republic. And of course, most famously in 1789, the French Revolution begins. And all of these revolutions aim to create, right, political orders, states that are subject to, that serve the civil society over which they rule. And so I would say that one really needs to think about all of these revolutions of the later 18th century in the Western world as one. A very famous historian named R. Palmer, Robert Palmer, famously referred to this period of rebellions and upheavals in the Western world, the late 18th century, as the age of the democratic revolution. And he really insisted we need to think of these all as kind of one gigantic political movement by which the forces of what he called the forces of democracy rose up again and challenged the forces of aristocracy. And I guess I would just say that if you were sitting there in Europe in say the 1780s and 90s, you would say, what we now call liberalism or social contract theory actually has a purchase on the world because the United States has come into existence.
Right. And we can see that impact carried over even later as well. In Latin America, of course, has a lot of bourgeois democratic revolutions, and in which they break from Spanish colonialism, establish their own republics, and with flawed but marginally liberal democratic systems that fluctuate between dictatorship and democracy, but still you have this huge impact, and revolutions that were even became communist ended up using that very language, right? Perfect example being the Cuban Revolution. If anyone wants to look at Fidel Castro's speeches leading up to the Cuban Revolution against Batista, is he's actually like quoting the Constitution. He's invoking all of this exact language of the American Revolution. And of course, this is Castro who would become, you know, leader of the Communist Republic of Cuba, Socialist Republic of Cuba. So you also have that in China, not so much under Mao, but in even the communists in China, including Mao, had a very positive relationship of their previous bourgeois democratic revolution that led to the establishment of China as a republic, well, a constitutional monarchy and republic, and Sun Yat-sen, who was the father of that, essentially, was considered a hero by Mao Zedong, right? And so you see that even today, right, in Venezuela, Venezuela and other Latin American countries too, they all have a very strong, favorable position of Bolivar, and because of course he's like major figure in Latin American revolution. So you see this effect everywhere. But what is interesting, and this is the core real question of this discussion today, is Americans have increasingly had a very different relationship to their revolution, especially people on the left. Whereas the left in Latin America and in many other countries tend to view their bourgeois revolutions as a stepping stone, which they tend to view positively and trying to go beyond it. But you've had many different attacks on that sort of perspective that you're presenting when it comes to the revolution. You have it from, for example, most famously, probably recently, would be the 1619 Project, of course, which has sparked a lot of debate. We can get into your critiques of that and the ways in which the American Revolution has been sort of rewritten, if you will, in history. But first, what is probably going to be very interesting to listeners here who might be on the left of center is how did Marxists, the original Marxists, see the American Revolution? Because we know Marxists today tend to consider it as a counter-revolution of sorts, or as a more conservative bourgeois revolution with a less radical character compared to the likes of the French Revolution. And at worst, they will just say it was a counter-revolution slaveocracy against Britain to keep more slaves. But you have all these different perspectives. I think first and foremost, how did Marx, Engels, and then their successors like Kautsky and Lenin view the American Revolution?
Marx authored the address that the First International, the Working Men's International, wrote to Abraham Lincoln on the occasion of his reelection in 1864. And in the address, he refers to the United States as the first land, as really the area where the revolution of the 18th century took strongest hold, where the first great democratic republic sprung up. I don't have the exact language, but that's the spirit of what he's saying. And in the conception of classical Marxism, by which I, let's say broadly mean from the writings of Marx and Engels through to the kind of height of the Second International, the United States played an important role because it was there that bourgeois society emerged with less compromises with the past than elsewhere. That is to say, bourgeois society emerges in Europe first during the later Middle Ages and the early modern era. But it does so essentially as a process of late medieval feudal European society transforming itself. And so bourgeois society emerges there with incredible compromises with the past. What do I mean by that in concrete terms? Right? If you look at the world of 18th century Europe, you have many absolute monarchies, you have many aristocracies that date their lineages back to the Middle Ages with coats of arms and family dynasties. You have massive tax collecting bureaucracies and standing armies, massive religious establishments that enforce religious uniformity, whether that's the Lutheran Protestant Church of Sweden in Sweden, or that's the Roman Catholic Church in Spain, or what have you, right? Those things all exist. So bourgeois society emerges in Europe through the transformation of a long-standing medieval Christian world. In the Americas, and above all in colonial British North America, bourgeois society emerges with the least compromises with the past. Right? Colonial British North America is not based on the conquest and subordination of a highly developed civilization like the Spanish Empire in Mexico, right? The Aztecs had a highly sophisticated and developed civilization that the Spanish conquered and subordinated. In British North America, when you have either acquired land, the British Empire builders either acquired land from indigenous people or dispossessed indigenous people, right? And then implanted colonial settlements. And so from the beginning, colonial British North America is a commercial society or a bourgeois society that has no feudal pre-modern background that it's developing on, right? In fact, just as a class example, Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations says the ideal way that commercial society, or what we might call bourgeois society, should have developed was first in commercial agriculture and farming, and then it would develop, manufacturing and industry, and then eventually you would develop foreign trade. But he famously says in book 3, he has this whole story about the emergence of commercial society in Europe, where he says it didn't play out this way. It emerged first in these kind of free city states, and then it affected the countryside by kind of dissolving feudalism, etc. But what he also points out in the book is colonial British North America is more or less meeting his model, meaning it's emerging first as agriculture, commercial farming. It's by manufactured products from Britain. But anyway, I've taken us a far afield there. But I guess what I would stress is for classical Marxism, the reason why the United States was so important is because colonial British North America was where bourgeois society took shape with making the least compromises with the past. And with the creation...
Is that why Adorno said America is where the bourgeois revolution, or where bourgeois freedom is most complete?
Yes. I mean, that's one of the reasons.
You quoted Lenin in your speech as well, which surprised me. Lenin said something of that sort as well about the America being among the most advanced of the... I was wondering where that quote was from.
Letter to American Workers. Letter to American Workers. He says where freedom is most complete.
Where freedom is most complete. Yeah, okay, that's what I wanted to see, because the way when people point out Karl Marx's praise of Abraham Lincoln in his letter, what today the reaction among Marxists often is, yeah, Marx was naive about the American Revolution because he didn't have access to the appropriate anthropology, and he didn't know the extent to which America was founded on genocide. Now, I brought this up.
Capital Volume 1 on primitive accumulation.
Sorry?
It's pretty well known what happens to the indigenous people of the Americas.
I'm just saying what people say is an objection.
No, I'm not. I follow you, but I guess what I'm saying is, do people think that Marx didn't know what happened to the indigenous people of the Americas?
Maybe to the extent.
Oh, that was well known in the 19th century. I mean, plus, I mean, the rhetoric he puts in Capital Volume 1 on primitive accumulation. No.
Well, I say this because there's a video on YouTube. It's pretty big, and it's well argued, called From Manifest Destiny to Lebensraum. From Manifest Destiny to, basically, the point is saying that the ideology of American expansionism influenced Nazism because of the way they treated the indigenous and the indigenous peoples, and that the reason why this wasn't really looked on by Marxists was because they didn't have access to the anthropological evidence of the exact extent to which they were subjugated. Now, I brought up this point, which is like to argue the other side in our previous discussion, and you brought up the point that, well, genocide did happen, but America wasn't founded on genocide.
Right.
And you brought up some interesting points regarding the founders versus what would happen under the Jacksonian era. I'm curious about that. I think listeners will find that quite interesting, and if you could point them to certain sources regarding that, because often liberalism is seen and Anglo-liberalism is seen as inseparable from the genocidal impulse. And
The Lacerdo argument.
yeah, well, I was going to bring that up too. Yeah, in Liberalism: A Counter History by Domenico Lasordo, he says, while bourgeois revolutions, particularly of the Anglo-American and Anglo-British, and he also uses Dutch as an example too. While they allowed for unprecedented freedoms for a large sector of the population, it actually led to the inverse for other sections of the population, such as slaves, black slaves, and indigenous peoples. Because his argument is that essentially, like the liberal idea of the individual, they were able to project that onto indigenous people, and indigenous people weren't seen as human; they were able to be seen as subhuman, and that they could justify because they were like backward according to their standards. So that there was a greater justification for genocide than there was before, as opposed to just trading with them. Now, you brought up some interesting points about the founders. How would you address that argument? Because you see this in almost every like mainstream communist party in America and in Canada too, but Canada's a more complicated story. That it's a settler colonial country founded on genocide. And some even call for the balkanization of the US on this basis. They say shouldn't exist. There will be no America under communism, after communist revolution. How do you address that genocide point?
Well, there may be no United States if, under communism, so to speak. I mean,
If communism is stateless, yes.
right,
But
exactly.
what I mean is like
The issue with that claim.
what I more mean is I think that they see there's like an implicit. It's not always very clear, but an implicit idea that it will be controlled by the indigenous nations, but it's not always clear because people argue different things. I don't really want to generalize land back movement because there are like reasonable people there, and then there's some who are very unclear about what they mean. But what I more mean is this founded on genocide point. You brought up an interesting point about the founders and their relation to indigenous people. I'm curious about that.
Could I ask you a favor? I do want to address this issue, but I feel like didn't fully complete my answer to your question about the
Mark,
American Revolution of the United States for classical Marxism.
sure, yeah, no. If you felt like there's more to add there, go for it.
I do want to add something because I don't want to claim that classical Marxism, devotes a great deal of attention to the United States of the American Revolution because it doesn't. But what I do want to claim is that at the core of classical Marxism is the view that the society of free labor has come into contradiction with itself and crisis. Okay. If Marx's only purpose was to point out that capitalists and workers often enter into disputes and that capitalists want to lower wages as much as possible and do everything they can to make as high a profit as possible, then he would have not had to write Capital Volume 1. That's all very well covered in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. You'll never find anything more critical of the capitalists than Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. He's very straightforward, right? That the corporations, the businesses, they constantly do everything they possibly can to combine and to remove themselves from the competition of the market to increase their profits in any way they can, etc. So Marx did not write Capital Volume 1 in order to be able to explain anything to do with, because he needed to talk about class conflict or he needed to talk about capitalist exploitation. Class conflict and capitalist exploitation are all extremely well covered in the literature of the 19th century. What most Marxists today mean when they say Marxism, we don't need Marx and Engels for it all. We could destroy everything Marx and Engels ever wrote, and you would still in other words, what most Marxists mean when they talk about Marxism is ubiquitous ideas and writings, ubiquitous throughout the ideas and writings of the 19th century, right? Most Marxists today think that the reason why Marx and Engels had this long shared intellectual project, the reason why they set pen to paper is because of class. They wanted to demonstrate the necessity of class conflict, or they wanted to demonstrate capitalist exploitation. Many other writers in much more accessible writing did that in the 19th century. You don't need Marx and Engels. You certainly don't need Capital to get to that. What they wanted to do was to demonstrate that the society of free labor came into self-contradiction and crisis, right? And Marx effectively calls that contradiction and crisis, which issues in a new form of unfreedom, a new form of social domination that free laborers impose upon themselves. He called that capital, okay? And basically, all of their work is premised on the idea that bourgeois emancipation actually happened. There was such a thing as the bourgeois revolution. There was such a thing as liberalism. There was such a thing as the revolutionary transformation of social and economic and political life. Meaning you can't even get to classical Marxism. You can't even get to Marx and Engels. You can't even get to Capital unless, right, understand, right, that there was such a social and political emancipation. Okay, so the reason why the American Revolution and the project of the United States is so important in the background thinking of classical Marxism is because it's in the United States that bourgeois society has made the least compromise with the past. It's in the United States that commodity production and exchange, bourgeois production, has been the basis of life since the beginning. It's in the United States where the society of free labor has taken clearest shape and form, okay? And so what I'm trying to get at, Tony, here is that the reason why the American project or the American experiment is a kind of important background note in classical Marxism is because classical Marxism assumes that the bourgeois revolution was the greatest emancipation in human history. But the greatest emancipation in human history has led to the industrial capitalist society of the 19th century with all of its pathologies and problems. And so what Marx and Engels are trying to do is to explain why the society of free labor entered into contradiction and crisis, okay? And therefore, if you realize that their project is that, to explain why the society of free labor entered into contradiction and crisis, then you see the importance of the American experiment to them because they think that the society of free labor has taken greatest hold there, or bourgeois society has taken greatest hold there, okay? And I guess I would just put it this way, if there's another way I could put it. Marx and Engels don't think that, like classical political economy, the thinking of Adam Smith is wrong in the sense that Adam Smith was in error, or that the Wealth of Nations is a work of propaganda. Rather, Marx and Engels think that the society described by the Wealth of Nations has come into contradiction and crisis. And therefore, the thinking of Adam Smith can't really make sense of the world of industrial capitalism. The thinking of Adam Smith, the thinking of classical liberalism, has been rendered ideological in the 19th century because that thinking is fundamentally a thinking of the 18th century. And the 18th century no longer holds in the 19th century. But they really thought that emancipation, that liberal emancipation, that bourgeois emancipation had taken place, right? They really believed in what I will simply call the gospel of Adam Smith. And what I mean by the gospel of Adam Smith is not market fundamentalism, okay? What I mean by the gospel of Adam Smith, his great teaching, if you will, the good news of Adam Smith, is that the individual and society are not in tension with one another. Society's development does not have to be at the expense of the individual, and the individual's development does not have to be at the expense of society. According to Adam Smith, in the society, in a commercial society, in a society of free labor, where everybody determines the course of their own existence, where everybody pursues their own interests, where everybody does what they want to do, in that society, right, you will have the free social and economic cooperation of that society will lead to such heights of productivity and efficiency, such a creation of a variety of goods and services at high quality and low cost, such a generalization and diffusion of wealth that it will redound back to the individuals that compose it, making them even freer. So the gospel of Adam Smith, the good news of Adam Smith, is that actually the freer individuals are, the more they can determine the course of their own existence, the more they actually will extend the division of labor, expand the market, and lead to a highly efficient and productive commercial society of great wealth and prosperity, which will in turn provide greater freedom for individuals. So Adam Smith's whole point about the society of free labor was that individual freedom furthers collective or social freedom, and collective and social freedom furthers individual freedom. The society and the individual do not have to be in tension. In commercial society, the free individual and the free society can actually be the basis of each other, can actually further advance each other. Free individuals advance the development of society, according to Adam Smith, and the development of society advances the basis of individual freedom. Marx and Engels absolutely took that for granted. That really happened. That Smith wasn't lying. That was really going on in the 18th century. And so they absolutely thought the American experiment was important, because not only had the Society of Free Labor taken greatest shape there, had it taken greatest hold in colonial British North America and the United States, but it had actually, undertaken a political revolution by which it had conquered the state power and subjected it to itself, right? So that's why they thought the United States and the American experiment were just in their background were fundamentally important, right? And that's why when Marx addresses Lincoln, right, the reason why he's congratulating Lincoln on his election, as Marx knows, as every left intellectual of the 19th century knew, that the United States Civil War was at its heart about whether or not the Society of Free Labor, for all of its problems that were very clear by the 19th century, would go on, or would it be replaced by an alternative answer to the labor question, i.e. slave labor, right? So they were congratulating Lincoln on his reelection because they were very clear, right, that they wanted to live in a political world where the American experiment, the project of the United States, the greatest political project organized around free labor ever, did not go out of existence, or did not transform to a political project organized around slave labor, which was the question at the heart of the U.S. Civil War. So that's why it was so important to them, right? One has to understand the nature of Marxism's critique of bourgeois society. They do not think, it's not a romantic critique, right? It's not that bourgeois society is some horror, or people are also selfish and self-interested, or it's just about capitalist exploitation and the mistreatment of the workers and corruption, right?
You get that in the manuscripts. You do get that in the manuscripts, but less in Capital, I find. Like in
you mean
the manuscripts does feel like young Marx does feel like a bit of a romantic critique of aspects of alienation and stuff like that.
No, you're right.
Whereas in German ideology too, there's like a lot of critiques of bourgeois ideology, but then in Capital Volume 1, which is as far as I've gone, I haven't gone past that, other than little excerpts and stuff like that I was assigned. But in the Capital, as far as it seems, is more neutral insofar as it's like an impersonal objective analysis of the relations of production and their evolution, as opposed to, I just want to address that there, because when we say that there isn't a romantic critique, yes, but also there is.
So that I accept that correction. I mean, I think you're right. I was speaking about Marx and Engels as if though their whole body of writing is one. What I wouldn't agree with you on is that early Marx has romantic elements. I don't think it's simply put romantic, but there are undoubtedly romantic elements to early Marx. I accept that. But I actually think part of Marx's growing political and intellectual education is coming to terms with his own early romanticism and overcoming it. And I think the Marx of Engels, particularly the Marx of the later 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s, is as anti-romantic a figure as one can find, right? It lacks any kind of romanticism,
So
right?
you do think he had an epistemological break?
I'm
You
familiar
don't
with
have to
the full
answer that.
Marxological debate over Althusser and others, but what I would prefer to call it is an intellectual evolution, right? No, listen, there's no question that much of Marx's later insights are there also earlier on. So I don't think there's some kind of fundamental break, right? What's the Althusserian position? He's a
There's
humanist.
Yeah, he goes from humanism to non-humanist, but yeah, the point is he does go from a more romantic critique to a more scientific type of analysis of capital.
What I would say is that Marx early on is a Central European intellectual who is living in a society that is becoming industrial capitalist with all of its problems and pathologies, and that is concerned to make sense of that society and its problems, is informed by what I consider both radical, that is liberal and socialist, but also romantic impulses. But that over the course of his intellectual development, and I would not consider it a break so much as an evolution, Marx comes to terms with and overcomes those earlier romantic elements, right? And essentially, I would say that, for all intents and purposes, the Marx that we get of Capital is the Marx that is basically a liberal in crisis. That is to say, someone who genuinely believes that liberal emancipation, bourgeois emancipation was the greatest achievement of human history, but it's come into contradiction and crisis with itself. And he needs to figure out why that's the case and how potentially to address it, if that makes sense. But all I guess I'm really trying to say here is that there's a lot of people who will say, a lot of writers will be like, oh, I read Capital Volume 1, and then I read Marx's writings on the US Civil War, and I don't understand how this is from the same person. In Marx's writings on the Civil War, he sounds so much in favor of the United States and kind of the American experiment and project. But he's this guy who wrote Capital Volume 1, where he, is clearly aware of particularly you get to primitive accumulation. He's clearly aware of the development of the Atlantic world being based on the expropriation of indigenous peoples, slavery, etc. He's clearly concerned with capitalist exploitation, etc. The point is, these things are not contradictory.
What I think should clarify is not it's yes, Marx was obviously aware of how this was founded, like the United States, what happened in terms of primitive accumulation. But what I think is the argument that people who who say that Marx wasn't quite aware of the extent is they argue that the expropriation of indigenous peoples wasn't something that was a crisis of bourgeois revolution, but something that was tied up in it. Like that, for example, Lizardo says that the expropriation of indigenous people and the intensification of chattel slavery were a result of that bourgeois revolutionary project. That's what he calls it, a paradox of the bourgeois revolution. Because on one hand, he argues, yes, it was emancipatory, but on the other hand, he thinks that it's tied up in the ideology itself, bourgeois ideology itself. So as a result of something that was a relic that is pre-bourgeois, right? Because of course Marx is praising Lincoln for wanting to end slave relations, essentially, or like he sees that if America overcomes slavery, that it'll be probably the most advanced country in the world, push history forward. But Lizardo would see slavery is not in a contradiction per se in the liberal bourgeois revolution experience. He thinks the intensification of slavery was a result, and he points to the fact that property rights, allowed for a greater domination of slave owners over slaves, and that he points out how actually it was way worse for slaves in America, Dutch Republic, and England than it was in Spain, for example. I'm just giving that argument, so like that's He makes what is other people have made this case before, like Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery,
Mhm.
makes that argument too. But I think Lazardo just makes a more powerful case for it. I think that's kind of, I just want to clarify that, and you can get to kind of addressing that whole point. And this could relate us to the second question about the founded on genocide debate.
Oh, right. So I'm sorry. We should go back to that. Would you like me to address the issue of slavery first, or?
Yes, yes, because it's related. I just want to say I figured out the quote, the Lenin quote you were referring to. It's from The Results and Significance of U.S. Presidential Elections, and where he says, I'll quote it: "Freedom in the USA is most complete, and for a whole half century since the Civil War over slavery in 1860 to 1865, two bourgeois parties have been distinguished there by remarkable solidity and strength. The party of the former slave owners is a so-called Democrat." Yeah, I don't need to read the rest of it, but he's basically seems in this thing, from what I'm seeing, is on the one hand critiquing bourgeois democracy for not having any real significance for the proletariat. It actually says that directly under there, but saying that it's where its freedom is most complete. So it's, yeah, make of that how you will. But it's regarding slavery. How would you like to address that whole way that people who are consider themselves Marxists say that Marx and Engels were too optimistic about bourgeois revolutions and America especially?
Well, let me say this, which is I looked at the Lacerda book when it came out. I haven't really looked at it recently. I don't have a memory of it that strongly, but that kind of, so let me not address that book specifically, but let me address the general claims made about slavery. There is a difference between saying that the emergence of bourgeois society was bound up with the proliferation of slavery, obviously the transatlantic slave trade and transatlantic slavery, and saying that bourgeois society is a product of, and inevitably, in some words, a product of slavery or somehow based on slavery. So let me articulate that sort of more clearly. What I mean is, it's one thing to historically point out, which is undeniable, that the development of bourgeois society was bound up with the flourishing of the transatlantic slave trade and transatlantic slavery. It's another thing to say that the self-conscious ideology of bourgeois society, liberalism, was pro-slavery or had anything to do with slavery other than being anti-slavery, right? I, as both a professional historian and a Marxist, believe simultaneously that the emergence of bourgeois society was bound up with the flourishing of the transatlantic slave trade and transatlantic slavery. But I also think that it was the development of bourgeois society that made possible not only the end of transatlantic slavery and the slave trade, but of all slavery in human history. And I think liberalism was from the beginning anti-slavery, meaning they meant what they said. They were anti-slavery, and I believe it. And I hold both of those things up. So let me just go into some detail. When I say the emergence of bourgeois society, I'm talking very broadly of, let's say, roughly from the later Middle Ages to the 18th century. Okay. And there's,
Like Renaissance?
yeah, let's say Renaissance to the Enlightenment. Let's frame that. I mean, people start at different times. Everybody has different dates, but let's just say Renaissance to the Enlightenment. Does that work for you? Okay. So you have in the late 15th century, the onset of the age of exploration. The Portuguese in 1486, 1487 round the southern tip of Africa, establishing a direct maritime passage between Europe and Asia. A few years later, you have Columbus traversing the Atlantic. Now, in the subsequent 3 centuries following those developments, you get the development of commercial society or bourgeois society, right, primarily in the Atlantic world. And as commercial society or bourgeois society is emerging, as it's first emerging, it transforms a pre-existing slave trade in West Africa into a kind of new and unprecedented system of transatlantic slavery. Let me say a little bit more about that. So obviously the Portuguese had been exploring down the west coast of Africa for a long time, right? And therefore were the first participants in the slave trade. But essentially, as the Europeans start exploring conquering and colonizing in the Americas. And as you get the growth of commercial society or bourgeois society, and you get an immense expansion of trade, there's the development of plantations by Europeans in the New World. And by and large, I'll just use the example of that I know best, colonial English America, right? In the Chesapeake region, there's the development of tobacco plantations. That is in the colonies of Virginia and Maryland. There, the development of tobacco plantations, and obviously, plantation slavery extends throughout the southern parts of colonial British North America, right? So the kind of plantation slavery in tobacco and rice and indigo in Virginia and Maryland and the Carolinas. That plantation slavery, though, is not originally, those plantations, those tobacco, rice, and indigo plantations are not originally served by slave laborers, right? Their indentured servants are what largely work them. That is, when you begin to get the development in the southern part of colonial English North America, in Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas of plantations, the aim is to employ indentured servants. That is, people from England or people from Europe that you pay the passage over and you provide them room and board. And in turn, they agree to an indenture, a contract where they're basically your unfree laborer for a period of time, 5, 10, 15 years, what have you. And at the end of that period, you give them their kind of freedom dues where they get a bit of money, some tools and equipment, and they're basically go off on their own and they become free. Now, plantation labor, whether it's tobacco plantations in Virginia or rice plantations in the Carolinas, is pretty brutal and difficult. And once indentured servants have fulfilled their contract, they do not want to return to the plantations as wage laborers, meaning it's the hope of many plantation owners that when the indentured servants are fulfilled the terms of their contract by which they were provided the costs of their passage and they were provided room and board and they were set up in the New World, it's hoped that those people will become, wage laborers on those plantations. But there's a wide availability of affordable land in the New World. So unsurprisingly, indentured servants, once they're free, prefer to become small property owners. They prefer to become family farmers, right? There's widely and cheaply available land in North America. They want to be independent, meaning they don't want to be subject to anybody else. So they want to go and settle a small piece of land where they provide for themselves and their family and exchange surpluses freely and cooperation with other people. So the indentured servants aren't going to work as a source of a labor supply. Now, initially, plantation owners attempt everything they can to stop that from happening. They try and illegally extend the terms of service, meaning you agree to just work for 10 years and they try and double it to 20. The plantation owners try and gobble up all the land, or they use their influence on the colonial government to prevent people from being able to settle west on land. They try and stop that, but ultimately they're not able to. And to make a long story short, they ultimately have to afford these once indentured servants the rights of Englishmen, meaning these people that have come over as indentured servants are understood once they're free to have the full rights of Englishmen, right? So they have rights of habeas corpus, trial by jury, civil rights, etc. You have to treat them and accord them a certain amount of liberty, etc. As a result, increasingly the plantation owners look for an alternative labor supply. And that alternative labor supply ends up being West Africa, enslaved people from West Africa. Now, the Portuguese and the Spanish first, and then the Dutch, the French, and the English all strongly participate in the West African slave trade. Initially, the European participation in the West African slave trade had looked something like this. They showed up along coastal West Africa, and they were aware of an internal trade in slaves in West Africa between kingdoms and countries. Now, that internal trade is mostly based on trading prisoners of war, right? It's classic. Throughout all of human history, there's been slavery, right? A kind of patriarchal slavery, prisoners of war, etc. But because commercial society and bourgeois society is developing so rapidly, It's the case that European enslavers on coastal West Africa have an insatiable demand for slave labor. So they're willing to offer incredible amounts of money to West African kingdoms and political elites in return for a slave labor supply. So what happens is this West African slave trade, which is a classical civilizational slave trade, begins to transform in order to provide slave labor for a kind of coerced immigration across the Atlantic, where people come and basically work on these plantations. And that's a huge benefit for the English plantation owners in North America, because it means you have a totally captive labor force, a labor force that you're never, ever having to make free, and that you don't have to accord the rights of Englishmen. So you could treat it in a much more brutal, degrading way, right? So what I'm trying to say, Tony, by going into all this historical detail, is it seems to me undeniable that the development of commercial society, bourgeois society, ends up being bound up with the development of plantations in the Americas, and that these plantations have an insatiable need for labor. Why do they have an insatiable need for labor? They have an insatiable need for labor because they're producing things like tobacco that are being bought in Western Europe for incredibly high prices and incredibly good prices and incredibly high amounts. Why? Because Western Europe is a developing bourgeois society where people are increasingly becoming free laborers who have expendable income and who really like tobacco as a kind of, product of their leisure, a product of their, a consumer good that they can enjoy in their leisure time. Tobacco is the most successful commodity in world history at that point. And so, yes, bourgeois society, the society of free labor that's emerging in Western Europe, right, is a society that is a commercial society that has unprecedented demands for the production of new goods and services. And there's no question that the plantations in the New World are being driven by the fact that tobacco is so profitable and consumed in such great amount by the society of free labor in Western Europe. And there's no doubt that those plantations have an insatiable need for a captive labor force, and that drives transatlantic slavery. But by the 18th century, by the Enlightenment, by the American Revolution, bourgeois society has fully developed and it's become conscious of itself. Meaning, I always insist, I have this position on the Enlightenment, that the Enlightenment should best be understood as bourgeois society or civil society becoming self-conscious, becoming aware of itself. And essentially, you don't need to read contemporary leftists. You can just go back and read Enlightenment philosophers and see that they're grasping that their society has produced a new horrific form of slavery, the form of transatlantic slavery. But they're extremely critical of it, right? And they want to eliminate it. And furthermore, this bourgeois radicalism of the Enlightenment doesn't just want to get rid of the transatlantic slave trade and transatlantic slavery that was bound up with the development of bourgeois society. They're against slavery as it's existed throughout all of human history. So you get the development of an anti-slavery ideology, and you get the development of manumission and abolition societies that want not simply to eliminate slavery that has developed with the growth of bourgeois society, but want to eliminate all forms of slavery ever. And I really think the best possible, not the best possible, but I really think you don't need any contemporary leftist to understand that there was a development of slavery with commercial society, bourgeois society. You could read the bourgeois radicals of the 18th century themselves. They're fully aware of it and they're opposed to it. They're making plans to get rid of it. And just to conclude with all of this, so I hope I'm clear about how one can say that, yes, absolutely, the emergence and development of bourgeois society, the society of free labor, was bound up with the flourishing of the transatlantic slave trade, transatlantic slavery. But that doesn't mean that bourgeois radicalism or liberalism is in any way pro-slavery. That doesn't mean that bourgeois society needs slavery. In fact, what bourgeois radicalism is pointing out, what bourgeois radicals of the late 18th century are saying, the bourgeois radicals of the Enlightenment, of the American and French Revolution, what they're saying is slavery is an obstacle to the further development of bourgeois society. That is, slaves can't be consumers, right? The slave plantation owners basically provide them their subsistence, and it's a very low level of subsistence. And therefore, slaves can't be consumers. They can't buy consumer goods. And slaves also aren't free laborers, meaning they're not participating in the free social and economic cooperation of commercial society or bourgeois society, which means they're not participating in the extension of the division of labor, in the expansion of the market, in the free social and economic cooperation that drives human flourishing, prosperity, and improvement. So I would say that contra Lacerdo, there is no more radical critique of transatlantic slavery than the critique that was made by 18th century bourgeois radicals, the critique that was made by 18th century Enlightenment liberalism. And that critique is this. It is not that the wealth of the West is the product of slavery, but rather that the wealth of the West is being limited by slavery. Now, I know many of your listeners will be shocked and horrified by that. It sounds like the reduction of people to economic sums, but let me just elaborate on what I mean by that. What I mean is the bourgeois radical, the Enlightenment, the liberal critique of slavery is that not just that it's a crime against the people that have been enslaved, but it's a crime against the society in which they've been enslaved. Because all of those people who have been enslaved, if they had been made free and allowed to freely participate in the society of which they were a part, could have made far greater contributions to the wealth and prosperity and flourishing of that society than they could have been being enslaved, right? And I think the bourgeois radical or liberal position on slavery is not that the wealth of bourgeois society was due to slavery, but rather that bourgeois society could have been even more flourishing and prosperous, right, by eliminating slavery. Or another way of saying all of this is to say, because are you familiar with this historiography, the new history of capitalism?
I think that's what Eric Williams is like bound up in.
So Eric Williams wrote in the mid 20th century.
I'm not exactly sure. Like, you'd have to name me some authors.
Sven Becker, Edward Baptist. Sven Becker wrote a book called The Empire of Cotton. Edward Baptist wrote a book, The Half Has Never Been Told. There are some others, but I don't remember their names. I would say those are probably the most important or significant. But basically, just to clarify, Eric Williams was a mid 20th century author. He wrote Capitalism, Slavery, which is a book I much admire. It's had a lot of influence on me. He was also the prime minister, by the way, incidentally, at one point of Trinidad and Tobago. But that all being said, the new history of capitalism is a phenomenon of the past 10 to 15 years. And what the new historians of capitalism say is that capitalist development was fundamentally based on slavery. In particular, what they say about the United States is that the wealth of the United States was extracted from slavery. And what I would say is what bourgeois radicalism said, what the Enlightenment said, what liberalism said, with which I believe classical Marxists agree, is that true human flourishing and wealth is bound up with free labor. That for some people to be wealthy does not mean that other people have to be poor or miserable, right? That's the kind of zero-sum thinking. That's the kind of zero-sum practices that characterized all of human history prior to bourgeois society. That is, prior to the society of free labor, if a country or an empire or a particular group of people, a caste of society, a social group, was to try and become wealthier and more prosperous and flourishing, it would often be at the expense of other people, right?
Isn't that still the case? That's Marx's whole point with exploitation, no?
No, I don't think that's the case. I don't think Marx thinks that.
That you don't think that Marx says that the bourgeoisie profit off the proletariat?
Yes, but I think he would recognize that both the proletariat and the bourgeoisie become substantively wealthier over time.
Oh, yes, of course, yeah.
But
I'm not saying that he thinks that it's the same as like serfdom, but there's a reason for why like Marxists end up using, well, why else would Marxists say wage slavery in terms like that, right? To say that like bourgeois revolutions weren't able to go far enough in realizing their own ideals.
It's a question of the far enough, meaning the Marxist category of wage slavery means free labor under the conditions of industrial capitalism. Meaning, by industrial capitalism, I mean the way that bourgeois society comes into crisis and contradicts with itself after the Industrial Revolution. And so when Marxists or classical Marxists use the term wage slavery, they're very specifically referring to the condition of the proletariat, of proletarianized workers after the Industrial Revolution. They are not referring to the free labor that develops with bourgeois society. Okay. Marx did not think that the society of free labor was a society of wage slavery. He thought that capitalist society, that is the society, that bourgeois society in crisis and contradiction with itself after the bourgeois revolution, was a society of wage slavery. Still free labor, but free labor in crisis and contradiction with itself. But to go back to the point I was making, most of human history, both practices and ideas have been zero sum. That is, for some people to benefit, other people have to lose, right? I want a bigger slice of pie, which means you have to have a smaller slice. The thing about bourgeois society, that's not the case, right? The pie can grow for everybody overall, right? The pie can expand for everyone overall. And as a result, I think it's fundamental to understand that Marxism agrees with bourgeois radicalism and liberalism that some people's wealth is not inherently because other people have been made miserable. I think the true horror of the existence of slavery in the 19th century United States, and slavery only grows and grows year in, year out in the United States from, say, 1800, the election of Thomas Jefferson, all the way through to the eve of the Civil War. It grows and grows, but it actually, right, is to the benefit of a few people, i.e. the slaveholders, and to the great detriment of the society overall, right? I think for classical Marxists and for bourgeois radicals, right, looking at, let me just clear my throat and say my view of things, which I think would be shared by bourgeois radicals and classical Marxists, is that the great horror of the development of slavery in the 19th century, right, is that it is actually developing. It's a crime against both the people that are enslaved and against the society as a whole. Those people's enslavement is not why the free labor North is rich. The free labor North is rich and wealthy and prosperous because of the society of free labor, explained most brilliantly by Adam Smith in Book 1 of The Wealth of Nations, where people pursuing their own interests, setting the course of their own lives, will drive a process of free social and economic cooperation that is greater than the sum of its parts, that will create a society that's much more productive and efficient and wealthier than there's ever been before. Okay, that's why the free labor North is growing. And the South could have been that way too. But slavery is expanding in the South and pushing west at the cruel, inhuman expense of the people enslaved, only to the benefit, not of the wider society of free labor, to the slave owners, a small group of oligarchic aristocratic slave owners. That's the horror of that system. All of those enslaved people, if they had been made free, would have made the United States even wealthier, more prosperous, more cultured, more innovative, more scientific than it otherwise would have been. If all of those enslaved people had been free laborers, freely pursuing their own interests, their aspirations, and their dreams, there would have been greater cultural achievements, more arts, more innovation, more debate and discussion, a more flourishing civil society, and more association. That whole proliferation of slavery in the 19th century United States is a crime against the people enslaved, but it also was a crime against the wider society of free labor, who would have benefited from those enslaved people being free laborers and contributing to the society of free labor. So I really want to stress that slavery, the new history of capitalism says the free labor North flourishes because of the slave labor South. And I'm going to be crude, but I consider that utter bullshit. I consider that slander against the historical record, meaning the reason why the society of free labor, the reason why the northern United States is so prosperous and flourishing by the mid-19th century is because of the society of free labor. It's not because of the society of slave labor in the South. Furthermore, the society of the South could have been organized around free labor, and it would have been a benefit to the enslaved people first and foremost, but to the entire society of free labor across the United States and indeed the world at the time, right? those people were enslaved solely for the benefit of the whole plantation system and the slaveocracy that ran the southern United States and significant parts of the United States government throughout the first half of the 19th century. Okay. And I really reject the new history of capitalism because I think it's extremely regressive. I think it brings us back into zero sum thinking about the world. I think it falls beneath the horizon of bourgeois emancipation, which says for some people to become wealthy and flourishing does not require other people to suffer. In fact, the more everyone is wealthy and free and flourishing, the better off that is for everybody, right? I'll steal a line from Martin Luther King. You know, I'm forgetting, what is his famous line on justice? Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Mhm.
I would say the central conclusion of bourgeois radicalism is the suppression of freedom anywhere is a crime against freedom everywhere, right? I think the people of the United States and the world could have been even wealthier, prosperous, more self-determining, better off if the enslaved people of the United States were free laborers.
Okay, so I can't speak to the new history of capitalism, but I do want to bring up one of the core Lazardo counterpoints before someone in the comments angrily types it out. And that is, well, what he points out is at the same time, while bourgeois ideology is used to make anti slavery arguments, most famously with abolitionism, of course, but there's a double nature to it. He says there is an emancipatory quality, but he also thinks that there's a almost insidious other aspect to it, the paradox of liberalism, right? Because you were pointing out how you're very much saying that slavery was an obstacle to the realization of bourgeois society.
The full realization.
Cool, right. And Lazardo, what he points out is that while, yes, people who are anti-slavery were coming from liberal tradition, so were the defenders of slavery. And he cites how all of the main, like most famous defenders of the Confederacy, like John C. Calhoun, and he cites like famous Confederacy leaders making arguments for small government, for using liberal arguments for liberty against the state encroaching on their property rights. And ultimately, this is how the South was able to get away with what are very extremely anti-liberal practices or anti-enlightenment practices of slavery, but they justified it through liberalism, through property. And I guess this goes at the heart of what many Marxists today see why they're so critical of the American Revolution, because on the French Revolution, you did have some degree of skepticism of property. And you see Jean-Jacques Rousseau being on the more radical side of liberal political theory. He's very critical of private property, whereas John Locke, as many have pointed out, of course, he owned stocks in a company that owned slaves, right? He was a shareholder in the transatlantic slave trade. And of course, seems like a hypocrisy, right? And the point being there is that this whole property question, this question of property, is what makes liberalism a contradictory, paradoxical ideology that has, on the one hand, a highly emancipatory quality, but on the other hand, a very, like the opposite of emancipatory, in the sense that the preservation of property, when taken to its full conclusion, is what Lord Disorder is saying, can lead to using liberal ideology to defend slavery. And that's not necessarily something that is antithetical to liberalism, because the preservation of property was always bound up in it. And what I think he's coming from, what he's trying to do with this, the way I see Lazardo, because I think he's a Marxist Leninist, and he's trying to create a scholarly polemic against the ways in which communism is typically dismissed on the basis of all these people died for what costs. That's what always people who are anti-communist say. They point out the famines, they point out the killings, they point out the gulags, etc. And they say, well, that was part of communism. You can't separate it. Now, this is what it seems like this is the rhetorical project behind Lazardo. He's trying to like flip this on its head and say, well, liberalism was also bound up with all of this too. And that doesn't mean we should disregard liberalism entirely, but he's saying that liberalism is more bound up with crimes against humanity than communism is. And that's his argument with the whole emphasis on slavery, and why he says we shouldn't treat it like an accident that liberalism manifested in what he called a white master race democracy. And he says that this was not just true for America, but also Britain and also other bourgeois republics. You've already given quite a bit of a response to that to an extent. But I am curious about, again, because this is another way you can answer the question which I asked earlier, which I know, and it was a hard one to broach, is the whole founded on genocide debate. Because you pointed out in our conversation we had on the Swoletariats channel about the founding fathers having actually quite surprising views on Indigenous people that honestly I wasn't aware of, to be frank. I only knew that about Hamilton. But I would like you to get into that as a way of sort of addressing this question, because what I'm really saying here is that you see this theme in most of us on the left, and you see this even with moderate liberals, like in the 1619 Project. They kind of just they try to say that America is an inherently racist project from the get-go. It seems like this new history of capitalism that you're talking about is related a little bit into this broader tendency to sort of essentialize the whole experience. Yeah, this is what I want you to address is the master race democracy, which is Lizardo's picture that he paints, and the founded on genocide. To what extent was America founded on genocide? Because they're obviously related questions, and they're I think some of the key things we need to address that people are probably typing already.
Which one do you want me to address first?
Probably master race democracy, and that's a way of. I think they go hand in hand because Lizardo says that liberalism has a paradoxical quality because it was radically emancipatory and democratic, but it was a master race democracy project in which slavery wasn't an obstacle to the realization of bourgeois democracy, but it was actually just directly related to it. And that's why he says we shouldn't be surprised when the Confederacy was championing liberal arguments to defend their slaves about property and such. And the founded on genocides are related to that too, because how was that justified? Well, the indigenous peoples don't regard land the same way that settlers do with regarding property relations. So therefore, they're obstacle to our project, and it justifies, and they're also antithetical to our view of humanism. There's a greater justification for genocide there. That's sort of the broader argument. I think you could address these both hand in hand if you like. You can choose which one you prefer to do first, but I think they're related.
I should just say Locke was anti-slavery. I mean, it's pretty clear from the second treatise of government, right? He's opposed.
Yes, but he owned shares. That's why he's trying to say there's there's like
I would recommend to your listeners the work of a historian named Holly Brewer. Last name is spelled Brewer, on Locke. She's published several articles on this, I think in popular venues, not just in scholarly venues. And, I think she's demonstrated very conclusively that he was actually not just critical of slavery as an abstract idea, but actually also critical of slavery as it was developing in the English colonies in 17th century North America. Yes. Did he own stocks apparently in the Royal African Company, which was involved in the slave trade? Okay, sure. He also wrote the Constitution of the Carolinas, which had slavery. But I think that there's a mistake being made, which is to say when people think about those things, meaning, first off, what needs to be understood is what we know by the 18th century of a race-based plantation slavery system, right, is just coming into being in the later 17th century, right? We really don't even have the first stirrings of that till the 40s and 50s, and those are just the first stirrings, that's 1640s and 50s. So when Locke's writing in the 1680s, 1690s, right, like the idea, that whole world that we just assume of a massive enslavement of people of African descent and plantation slavery in the New World is just coming to be. Okay. Secondly, we know that you can, again, examine the work of Holly Brewer. We know because Locke is a critic of any kind of slavery imposed on people, not for what he takes to be legitimate reasons, meaning they posed a threat to you. You were in a state of war with them. And so you had to subdue them, but rather a permanent slavery, and in particular, hereditary slavery, meaning a permanent enslavement from someone who doesn't threaten you and the enslavement of their future generations. I mean, he was quite critical of that. He was quite critical of that, and even critical of that as it was first emerging in the colonies. His owning of stock, honestly, owning stock in the Royal African Company would be like, I'll be honest with you. I'm a Marxist. I've got a retirement account. I'm sure there are investments in that account that if I got into the conditions in whatever factory was making whatever in Indonesia or China or what have you, would be a kind of quasi bondage, right? Does that invalidate what I'm saying to you or what I think?
The thing is, Jefferson also apparently had anti-slavery notes that he had. Like he had writings, unpublished writings that were anti-slavery, but owned the most slaves of the founding fathers.
Right.
On this, so what's up with that? I
Yeah,
think that's
published anti-slavery writings, not just unpublished.
published them. Okay.
Yeah. And so, what I'm trying to say is Locke owning shares in the Royal African Company as part of a larger portfolio of the later 17th century is not interesting. It's not like the idea that you find that, this invalidates Locke's liberalism. I just don't see the case that those people are making. But that being said, let me go to the greater question, which is you're saying, how did you put it? A master race democracy?
So,
I need to know.
Lizardo says that more or less what liberalism ended up becoming was it created the ideological superstructure for a master race democracy. And it was emancipatory, but for white property owners. And I think there's a lot of truth to it. I mean, if you look at how in practice this actually took shape, but you made this point and you pointed me to these sources about the founding fathers actually believing that indigenous people were capable of becoming property owners and that the actual genocide that happened was more Jacksonian era. And
Yes, that's right.
I didn't think of it that way. I thought of it before kind of just as part of the same trajectory because I saw it as Jackson was more or less after he gave rights to non-property whites, you had all this demand for land, and then they're like, okay, we need more land to like make people happy. Then he looks at the indigenous people who are refusing to make room for the settlers, and then it leads to manifest destiny and all of that. But yeah, I'm curious to elaborate on that point because about the founders is it's known now that Hamilton, there's a lot of evidence of him being not racist, quote unquote. What about the other founders, and how do you treat this claim that America was founded on genocide? Just because this is ubiquitous at this point among people on the left.
I don't agree with it. I'll say this. In the development and evolution of colonial British North America, from the early 17th century till the era of the American Revolution, there's no question that there is incredible mistreatment and expropriation of indigenous people, meaning dispossession of indigenous people of their lands. But there's also many cases of perfectly peaceable interactions, perfectly peaceable diplomatic and commercial exchanges by which land is traded hands, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Now, the United States is founded in the 1770s and 1780s. And it was the dominant view of the founders. I'm talking about people like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, all of these kind of classic founders figures that you could call them, I say, if I could use an old term, ethnocentric, but you could not call them racist in any kind of essential sense, meaning they believed that all people could be full participants in what they called commercial society, or what Marxists call bourgeois society, that all people could be free laborers, property owners, freely cooperating and transacting with one another. They believed that. And in fact, this is how they thought the problem of westward expansion was going to be solved, meaning people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson thought that the kind of really terrible relationships that had often occurred between colonial settlers and indigenous groups could be overcome with the formation of the United States, because they believed that the attraction of the new kind of civilization they were building, which I'll simply just call a bourgeois civilization, would be such that they would be able to pull the indigenous people into it and integrate them within it. Could I read you something, Tony? Would that be possible? It's fortuitous what happened earlier that I just happened to be at my office because I have a document here that would be useful. This is Thomas Jefferson's confidential message to Congress concerning relations with Indians, delivered on January 18th, 1803.
Well, that'll be it for this episode. We're already at the 2-hour mark, and we're not even at part 2 yet. Part 2, the second half of this podcast, this very long but rich conversation with James Vaughn will be uploaded next week. If you want to get access to it earlier, you can become a patron. In part 2, we'll be discussing the question as to whether the United States was founded on genocide and slavery, and more importantly, whether this invalidates the prospect of America becoming socialist, whether socialism is possible in America. This is part of our larger discussion on the American Revolution and the left's relation to it, how the contemporary left's attitude towards the American Revolution is quite different from the classical Marxist understanding of it. You can get access to part 2 early right now on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you not only get access to a lot of content early before everyone else does, but you also get access to exclusive content. You get access to the exclusive Backroom podcast, which is for patrons only. That never goes public. If you get value out of One Dime Radio and the videos that I do on the One Dime channel, then why not become a patron if you haven't already? It's not much for you individually, but if a bunch of you become patrons, then it is massive for me. Pretty much depends as to whether this channel survives or dies. But if you have like zero monies, then you can support the podcast by sharing it around and giving it a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple or wherever you listen to this. See you in the next episode.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimists, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.